Hello friends, welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today is summing up literary theory, and by this I would like to also tell you that this is last of our lecture in our series on literary theory, and the subject expert shall be summing up as is evident. So with this I would like to introduce our subject expert, Dr. Anand Prakash. He has taught English literature for more than 4 decades in Delhi University and is also the editor of the journal, Indian Journal of Drama Studies, and I'd like to welcome sir to our EduSite studio and request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you, Kami sir.
Thanks, Roshi, for your kind words. Today is as has been told to you, the last lecture on literary theory, and let me begin by saying that it has been a long journey. The discussions on literary theory began many months ago, and lots of areas in the field of culture, in the field of history, in the field of, in fact, writers and others, they were covered, and finally we have reached the end of this discussion. In this presentation, I would like to go over some of the important things that were discussed right from the beginning, and then give a kind of summing up, which would mean the relevance of literary theory to us today, its relevance as well as value. So literary theory is an aspect that has become important of late, but then it has been all along present in the history of ideas, in the history of literature, in the history of culture. Whenever human beings, if there is any point of time in history, whenever human beings started operating in the social world, they began using their minds, and the mind then evolved a kind of penchant, a kind of stance, and that's when literary theory or theory in general would have begun. So I don't want to go into that kind of history. I make the first point, by referring to the way a different kind of perception of reality emerged in history, in human history, and this happened for our purpose somewhere at the end of the medieval period, and not in our country, not in Asia. It happened somewhere in Europe. And it wouldn't have happened all of a sudden. There must have been certain factors that went into the emergence of, causing the emergence of thought of a different kind. And for the sake of convenience, I would begin by saying that this kind of a trend came to confront us, and it came with the European Renaissance. It's a very important phase, friends, viewers, because the modern history of humankind can be divided into two parts, pre-Renaissance and post-Renaissance. And this applies not just to Europe, this applies to the whole world, because as I have been saying, ideas travel from one place to another, and ideas are indivisible. Maybe they emerge in Europe, but straight away they become relevant to us. And many ideas would have emerged from here, and they traveled to the West. So it's an ongoing process. But when we talk about theory in general, then we realize that a new kind of theory, a new kind of attitude, a new way of looking at things, this began with Renaissance in our specific context. And Renaissance period cannot be particularly specified, but it's somewhere between the 13th, 14th centuries and the 16th century, when human beings started viewing the world in a crucially different way. Earlier, till the medieval period and before, a large number of active agents in the human imagination and in human behavior were gods and goddesses, kings, princes, all important people, who were socially, economically, politically important. It is they who wielded power, and the rest of the humanity was supposed merely to obey the dictates of these what I call the upper classes, the upper groups in society. But sometime in the 14th, 15th centuries, a new attitude developed. People, in order for guidance, in order to get guidance, started looking not towards the kings and queens and the Pope or religious heads or even gods and goddesses. They started looking at themselves. How it happened is not just a mere of conjecture, but of study. But then the fact is that a new kind of attitude towards what is called the material reality began during the Renaissance. And it was a gradual process. There might have been certain shifts also in the middle of it, but then this is how it happened. Now, I have used certain words with respect to this first point, where new ideas in history emerge. I use certain words, and like European Renaissance is an important word for us. Renaissance happened in Europe, and Europe was able to connect very significantly with the ancient history, the pre-Christian period, when human beings were not as much tied up, as much shackled by different things as they became later to do so. And then those areas of inspiration, regarding human beings interacting with gods and other people, and it was a tribal kind of a structure in the ancient world. Those things were later on became a bit unknown, relatively unknown, and in the medieval period, most of the people wouldn't generally think of the ancient literature or the ancient ideas or the ancient philosophers and their sense of appeal and inspiration. But then sometime around the time when what I'm discussing, the Renaissance, then people went back to those ancient texts and to those ancient writers, and there they realized that a different attitude existed, and that attitude was worth emulating. This might have been one push. The other push would be that human productivity increased post medieval period. People started working harder on the fields, and maybe at some point of time in Europe, surplus of funds would have been accumulated in certain hands, not necessarily of kings and the upper classes in Europe, and maybe then a tendency to trade in a different manner would have come up then. Whatever the reason, the world had started changing on the ground quite significantly in the Renaissance period in Europe, and that may have led to a new emergence of awareness. So I refer to these two things. One, that one came to know about the ancients specifically, and secondly, that social productivity considerably increased during the Renaissance period, and people then got that kind of sense of power, which they never had earlier. They became less servile, they became more inquisitive, they became more study oriented. They started looking at themselves as important agents of history. All these things happened around this time, and this may have given a fillip to the world of thought. Then Renaissance is associated in this manner with rational questioning of the material world. Now, I'm not going into the ideological world or the spiritual world, but of the material world. And by material world, I don't mean simply goods that are produced. I go by the way the cities had been planned, the way the villages existed, the way human beings raised crops, the way they moved around, the way they exchanged greetings with others, the social life, the neighborhood life, all these things. So that is the material world, and material world also consisted of social relations, that somebody is a king and somebody is a subject, that there is a court and there are ordinary people, there are merchants also, there are villages and there are towns, there are markets, there are certain territories. The world is divided into territories. You may not call them nations, but they are there, and different laws operate. Now all these things are material, whether it's law, whether it's production, whether it's neighborliness. All these things are material aspects of reality, and people started looking at them curiously, rationally, and they would then draw up conclusions which they had never done so. So ethics would have been questioned of the old variety. What should you do and what you should not do, what you should avoid and what you should adopt. This consideration of adopting or not adopting, this underwent a very decisive change in the Renaissance period. And now, since I am talking of attitude, therefore I say that this new attitude may have been the first reference point from where a new way of looking at things emerges. So at the center of the Renaissance view of with the world is the rational questioning. You see and you hear. You see something different from what you hear, and therefore you start comparing one with the other. And then, of course, you are guided by what you see, not by what you hear, because what you hear may be just the opinion of somebody. But what you see is your own opinion, is your own observation that will give you, that will help you forge a new opinion. And this kind of a clash, existed in the Renaissance world. So that is the beginning of what we call modern theory or critical theory or literary theory. Now, I have already introduced the idea of the conflict between what you see, what I see, and what I hear. And this becomes a social phenomena in the European Renaissance. The entrenched ideas, I use this word particularly, entrenched ideas which have been fixed in the minds of people since times immemorial. Maybe there have been 500 years, and the same definitions that existed earlier continue at the Renaissance in the Renaissance period. But then people started them questioning them, and that shook the entrenched ideas, the fixed ideas inside the minds and the behavior of the society in general. Now, of interest to us in the process is the struggle gradually increasing, not merely the domain of thought, but also in society. Now, this is a related point, but this is important, that when you have clash of ideas, it is not just the ideas that are affected, it is also society in general that is affected, because ideas come from powerful groups, and some perceptions are seen also by the lower masses. But then the struggle between ideas emerges, then in a way the struggle between two different sections of society emerges. So there was a dimension which could be called the social dimension or even the political dimension. From 14th century onwards in England and in Europe, there is a great deal of upheaval, there is a great deal of disturbance. Boundaries of countries are being redrawn, preferences of people are being changed. Earlier they would be driven by morality, now they want to be driven by pragmatism, practical considerations. And religious leaders will feel bad about it. Even the king or the prince or the feudal lord will feel bad about it, because these people have always got the support of religion. And when people start interpreting religion in their own manner, then of course the powers that be, the important people in society, they become threatened. And Renaissance is the period when upheavals began happening in most of the countries of Europe, and religion, morality, ethics, all these things were sought to be redefined. And it was a very violent period, because the upper classes would not allow the lower masses to assert themselves. Therefore, very strict action would be taken, said the upper classes, and the lower classes might have said, okay, at the moment we agree, but then we are dissatisfied with you. And there are different ways of saying so. One may not exactly say it through words, but then people disagree. When people are angry, then their anger somehow shows, and maybe at some point of time it will also erupt. Now, in order to make clear the indications of how these eruptions occurred in society, in my lectures earlier, I named these people. I'll just go over for a few minutes regarding them. For instance, Chaucer is one of the first in English history and also in European history, an author who talks about his contemporary reality, and it's a matter of choice for him. And apart from others, because there are others also at Chaucer's time. So Chaucer, like them, picks up characters from the ordinary life. He doesn't pick up characters from the high and mighty. He talks of a peasant, he talks of a small scholar, he talks of a host, which means somebody who's keeping a kind of place where people relax, they come and stay. It's a kind of a hostel. So, and then there are horsemen, then there are knights, small scale knights, etc. So he picks up those characters and he makes them talk. Now this wouldn't have happened all of a sudden. There must have been a history to it, and Chaucer may have been also inspired by the power and the intellectual appeal of these characters. Therefore, he gives the ordinary masses a chance to come forward and say what they want to say. Then you have a very important person in the Elizabethan period, and before that, in fact, he was in Henry VIII's time, Thomas More. And Thomas More is one of the finest scholars of Europe at that time, and his name had spread, not merely through England, but through entire Europe. And he had friends among scholars almost in the whole of Europe. And this person, of course, writes in Latin, but his ideas are very close to the ground. And I think I quoted this particular line from him, and this becomes a turning point in the history of humankind. He said, in his famous book called Utopia, he said that the private property is the root cause of all social evils. Now, this seems to be an idea that actually became popular in the 19th century. But Thomas More can say this in the early 16th century, that private property is evil. So you should try to abolish it, otherwise social justice will not be possible in the world. So if he can talk about a utopia where private property will not be accepted as the basic principle, and by private property it didn't mean the money that you have, it meant that the way you produce things and keep the entire produce yourself. When you invest money, and by investing money you make other people your slaves. That's what is meant by private property. So he's talking about that, and he said because the moment private property comes into operation, it divides humanity into two sections: the people who own private property and the others who work for this person. So Thomas More says this. Shakespeare, we have started reading Shakespeare now differently. It's not merely about kings and queens and princes, it's also about ordinary masses. And in fact, if you start counting the number of people that Shakespeare presents in his plays, you realize that they far outnumber the bigwigs, people in the court and all. And he gives them once again a chance to speak, and when they speak, they dazzle. So Shakespeare that way is one of the finest products of Renaissance for this purpose, and he can be today defined as a great humanist. And he's in a way that one can say that he's the closest observer, he's the sharpest observer of human behavior, as is shown in his plays. And this Renaissance ideal, which he is able to achieve, has some thoughts behind it. It must be a pattern. That there is a thought pattern in Shakespeare, and most of the theories, that will emanate from England at that time, those theories would evolve into what we see as a theory today. Then you have Bacon. Now Bacon's contribution is that what other people did, through suggestion, like Thomas More did through a suggestion, or Shakespeare does it through a suggestion. Bacon did it as a philosopher, and in fact he is one of the first to talk about what I said in the lectures, inductive logic. Inductive logic is that you don't learn logic from anywhere else except your behavior, except your practice. And the more you become active in life, the better knowledge you have of the material reality. So what is the source of knowledge in material reality? The material reality itself. If you become active, then of course you start thinking, and then from there you learn, and you go still further. Now this was proper theory of knowledge that this person began with, and this is called inductive logic, and this continues till today. That in every department of society in the 20th and 21st century, people go by what they perceive, what they see. They don't start with definitions. They always see the phenomena directly, and from there they draw up conclusion, then they go further from there. So this person in fact made this particular logic known to the thinking world of his time and later. Then because all these people happen to be in Europe, whether it's Chaucer, Thomas More, Shakespeare, Bacon, and they are products of Renaissance. Therefore, the first important social upheaval and political upheaval happens in England, and this happens in the 1640s, when the king is thrown out and a parliamentary democracy of that period is established in the middle of the 17th century. And this is a development that will have far-reaching consequences. England was till that time one of the economic powers in the world. But after this revolution, after this particular upheaval, which is called the English Revolution, England will forge ahead. And in the 18th century, England would be the strongest economic power in the world. So it is theory, it's knowledge of the world, it's theory of economics, of politics, of human behavior, that helps, that becomes a kind of support system for England to move ahead. This thing is not seen in other European countries, it's not seen in other countries of the world also. But then, because this kind of a theory struck roots in the English soil, therefore England had that kind of a chance to progress much more than the rest of the world.
Sir, I'd like to slightly interrupt you and also ask you a question. Say you were talking about how theory began and how it was being accepted and also being talked about either through writing or through philosophy. Mm-hmm. So then if one wants to really study, say, the beginning of theory, one could look to the writings of Chaucer, Thomas More, Shakespeare. So those would be, I think, as you already mentioned, wonderful examples of, instead of going to say a book which just merely talks about literary theory, but even look at these writers as examples and their ideas as illustrations of how theory began and what exactly theory is and what it talks about.
Absolutely, I think you have made a wonderful point, because the real knowledge lies not in the books. It lies with such people who talk about life, and that's how theory of the initial kind in the Renaissance period is a great inspirer. It encourages people a great deal to think about their own world, which may not be the case today. Even though we have lots of books of theory, these days people don't learn much from theory. In fact, even today, in the light of theory, they would be looking at the reality much more curiously, and that's how they learn. I think we are moving towards that. But yes, you have really given this insight that theory remains only a theory unless it takes examples from real life. And these writers were taking examples from real life, and they were putting them in their books, and that's how theory got enriched.
Yes,
so
sir.
Thank you for explaining this in this manner and bringing in this particular dimension. In the 18th century, because of this spurt in theoretical activity in England, through Parliament, things were discussed, then economic policies were drawn up, scientific policies were drawn up, and then England became a different country in the 18th century. Now, what was the rest of Europe doing in the 18th century? And there are scholars who point out that in England, people were inventing and they were making experiments with soil keeping, improvement of soil, water, irrigation, new seeds. So in a way, the landscape and the agricultural area in England was in fact far ahead in terms of productivity than, let's say, Germany, Spain, or other countries. And whereas in Germany and France, it was the great scholars who were thinking about a large number of philosophical things. In England, people were learning from experience in the villages. So England was being made in the villages, whereas in the other countries, the philosophers were interpreting the world. So in fact, these philosophers were, of course, they were very powerful philosophers, and they called themselves enlightened people, and there was a great tendency in the rest of Europe called the Enlightenment. England mercifully remained away from Enlightenment, because they were active in the actual field of production, and they were materially advancing, materially not in the sense of profit only, of course profit was one important part, but in the sense that physically, economically, socially they were advancing. So a lot of wealth was being created in England through the researches. So they were not Enlightenment people. Enlightenment was happening in France, where very good books were written. In Germany, you had great philosophers in the 18th and 19th centuries. That was not the case. because England didn't produce philosophers of the kind that Germany and France did. So it was not enlightenment, it was some kind of materialism that prospered in the country called England at that point of time. And it is this materialism which finally will see the presence of a new agent of production in the 19th century. This will happen through the material development of England. So first factories will be established in England in the 19th century, and there will be a new man called the worker, called the proletariat, who will emerge, who will present himself on the scene, a very productive person. And there will be a thinker called Karl Marx, who will identify this particular worker as the center of the contemporary world. And then from this worker's point of view, Karl Marx would evolve a new theory. This will be called the theory of historical materialism, which is also called Marxism. So this thing develops in the 19th century, and there is a history to the historical materialism. This history I have briefly traced from the Renaissance onwards. Now in the 19th century, with the coming in of historical materialism, you have in literary theory certain trends which began sometime in the 18th century, but they became strengthened in the 19th century. And the biggest theoretical trend from the literary angle is the trend of realism. So writers now will talk realistically. They will swear by the word reality that they can see, reality that they can imagine, reality that they can extend through their ideas. So it's an all-enveloping kind of reality that is the concern and the point of engagement of the 19th century literary writers. For instance, you have, apart from England, you have great realists in France. Now these people are not driven by the philosophy of enlightenment. They always look around, they see the behavior of the ordinary people and the more than ordinary people, the powerful people, and they write novels. In fact, the very idea that they are writing novels shows that they will not talk about the high and mighty. They will talk about ordinary people who speak prose, and they will talk about those stories where only ordinary people appear. So 18th and 19th centuries then would be the age of novels, and in these novels, realism will be the mantra. So anybody who is realistic will hold the appeal, will hold the attention of the reader. And if one is not realistic, then nobody will care to read those novels. So a kind of realism and an emphasis on it was seen in the 19th century, and this drew upon historical materialism directly or indirectly. Not that most of the writers read Karl Marx's books, but Karl Marx definitely read their books and learned from them. And that's how this kind of an interaction happened. So you have great realists from France like Balzac, you have Stendhal there, then you have other writers, Flaubert is there, then you have in England Dickens, who's a very materialist kind of a writer. Of course he is a bit idealistic in his approach, but then when he talks about life, then he emphasizes the material reality of the world in which he lives. So these things have been discussed in detail in my lectures. These isms like realism, there has been a reference to naturalism there, that people who are realists, some of them thought that if they study nature and nature of human beings and the geographical surroundings, and if they study the behavior of human beings, then that will be realistic for them. So whatever you say, you must have a reference to something real. And then they started saying, we'll write only that which our eyes can see and ears can hear. Now, there was a debate about this, whether naturalism is real. But then these people always thought that realism in its extreme form, in its most genuine form, is naturalism. So we discussed naturalism also in the 19th century. Then came existentialism. This occurs somewhere towards the end of the 19th century and goes up to the middle of the 20th century. Existentialism, important as the word suggests, it's a theory that talks about human existence. And the philosophy is that unless human beings are born, human beings can't be there. So existence comes first. And when they are born, then of course they will create some sense of meaning in their life. Then they will create morality, or the urge to live, the urge to struggle, the urge to understand, which is in existentialism is called essence. So they say that existence is important, and through existence you can reach essence. Essence means meaning, essence means values, etc. So that's how existentialism became a theory in the 20th century. Then came new criticism. New criticism, it was forged in England and America in the 1920s onwards, and it reigned supreme till 1950. And new criticism called itself new criticism because it was not relating literature, as was the case with historical materialists and realists. They were not relating literature to the outer environment. They said that literature per se is real, itself is real, and therefore they will discuss only the text. So in fact, this new literary theory was that literature should not be called literature. The literary text should be called a text. It's not literature, it's not writing. Because when you say it's a writing, then there is a writer. And they said for us, the writer or the writing is not important. The cluster of words which is there on the page in the printed form, it is that which is important. So new criticism started emphasizing the interrelationship between words in a text, and therefore for them a work of literature or literary work became basically a literary text. Then in the 20th century the theory expanded further in its scope, and it started borrowing heavily from areas of linguistics, because after all literature being words, and words in a particular sequence, one has to go to the linguistic roots, and people started defining language not as a vehicle of ideas or as a medium. They started defining language as a cluster of signs and symbols and all those things. And this was discussed once again in some depth in the presentations earlier, but then words being shown as signs or signifiers or signified, and the relationship there, and you apply this to a literary text, and then take out the implications and the different hidden layers of meaning. All that laid stress on the newer areas of literature. Then came structuralism, which after all, language were not merely words but structures, and you could then there was a category called linguistic structures, linguistic structuralism, and structures operated not merely in language, they also were there in social life. So there could be social structures. For instance, there are certain morals, there are certain other principles, ethics, etc. And there can be classes, there can be groups, there can be subgroups. All these are social structures. There can be workers, there can be the bourgeoisie, the capitalists. So that also is a structure. And you can study these structures in order to know the truth of the phenomena around oneself. Then came the another related field of theory in the 20th century. This was called cultural materialism, and the word itself makes clear as to what cultural materialism is, because materialism generally is not culture. Culture is only about aesthetics, only about the sense of beauty and harmony. But then cultural materialists started arguing that culture also is produced not in the minds of people but in the actual world, and that in fact if you look at a painting, if you look at a musician, after all musicians use certain tools or certain traditions, and these can be very clearly identified and verified. And culture, because it is produced through work which people do in the domain of life, therefore it has to do with materialism. So a new emphasis on materialism from the angle of culture, that also was shown to be the case in the 20th century. Then you had, because the world had changed from 17th and 18th century onwards up to the 20th century, therefore study of literature became a matter of teaching in the classroom. There would be a teacher who would stand before the students. He or she would give exercises to the students. Different words will be discussed, and conflicts will occur, and new theories will vie for supremacy with old theories, and these things brought in the particular feature of academy onto the literary scene. And books now would be read not for affording pleasure to the reader, but they would be read for giving material for research to the expert scholar. And Urvashi referred to me as an expert. So I'm in that sense a 20th century product of culture, who has studied certain things and then who would explain them with examples and all. But then this is not what the primary purpose of literature was. The primary purpose of literature was to directly talk to the reader. But then there came this expert in the middle of the writer and the reader, and this expert will explain to the reader some of the values and significance of what was being taught. So when this thing happened, then these scholars, these experts, they started contending with one another in terms of their preferences, and they would forge new theories. They will agree and disagree, and they will go into the fine points, etc. So in fact, in the 20th century, what happened was that with every 10 years, a new literary theory will emerge. This was not the case. The 19th century is the age of realism. There might have been 2 or 3 other theories then, but in the 20th century, if not by every 5 years, at least by a decade, a new theory emerges. And there is a large number of theories. I did my MA in 1965, and from then onwards, I've heard, if not more than 10, at least 10, different theories, coming up from this part of Europe, that part of Europe, etc. And of course, there are theories from India also and from the rest of the world. So now there is a kind of theoretical clash. There is a kind of theoretical crowding that is happening in the 20th century, and the reason is that people are going more and more into the world of ideas and conflicting opinions. So we have in the 20th century, apart from naturalism, existentialism, and new criticism, theories such as linguistics, as I said, structuralism, cultural materialism, and then in the 1960s onwards, you have things like post-structuralism. So in fact, the structuralism will be discussed in a new manner. It will be given a new interpretation, a new orientation, and it will be called post-structuralism. Now, post can have a large number of meanings. One meaning is that structuralism's field is over, its time is gone, and now you must think of something that happens after structuralism, so that is post-structuralism. Some others would say structuralism was wrong and something against it should be said. You reject the old and you establish a new one and a different one. A third will say that it should continue, even though it's post. There is a continuation, and in that continuation, the meaning is changed. So you start, doing this kind of hair splitting, and this is what the job of the experts is. So they start, disagreeing with one another, and then bring out the fine points. Then another important theory that came in the 20th century was deconstruction. Now this was definitely, decisive and very, debatable also, where the very construction of the work was called into question. For instance, you have a novel. It starts with certain characters, then it goes through events and characters, contending with them, and finally there is a conclusion. That is called the novel. Now it's a construction that the writer began, the writer developed, and the writer ended the work in a particular manner. Now deconstruction says that all this thing that the writer did was to impose his or her pattern on the book. But is that important? Should that pattern be accepted? This is the question that is raised by the experts, and they will say no. That was the particular author's point of view, and that created a pattern. Now somebody else will see a different pattern in the same book, because that person has a new mind and has a different opinion. So in a way, the reader starts replacing the author, because then what appeals to him is not that which appealed to the original author. So therefore, in deconstruction, you start saying that author doesn't have to play any role. He is just like one of us. He wrote the book, he disappeared. Now we have to read the book And in the act of reading the book, we are actually writing the book, because then we are finding our own patterns in the book. So in a way, when you find a new pattern, when I find a new pattern in a book, then I am rewriting the book, I am reconstructing the book. And in order to reconstruct, you must first destroy it, you must first deconstruct it. So throw away the old construction, throw away the old pattern, build a new pattern. After throwing old things brick by brick, you give a new pattern to the building called the work, and that is what is called deconstruction. Now this might have brought a great deal of difficulty to the study of literature, but then as a theory, this was really very fascinating, that a work of literature should not be taken as fixed. It's a fluid category. And in the folk tale, for instance, the same thing can happen, that everybody who tells the folk tale gives his or her own version. So why not the same thing be given to the written word? So deconstruction had that kind of thing to offer, and this reigned supreme for quite some time. Even today, it's quite popularly accepted and employed by people for their views. Then you had postmodernism. Modernism I didn't refer to earlier, but modernism also emerged like existentialism in the early years of the 20th century. But then in the 1970s and 80s, postmodernism emerged, and they started talking about the real and the unreal. And in fact, modernism said that the world has evolved so much, it has traveled so much from the past to the present, and it has changed so much that old definitions and old ideas do not remain relevant at all. In fact, no idea is relevant, because another idea is all the time there to replace it. And finally, that we live in the world of images where there is no material reality. So basically, we are not in touch with the material reality, we are in touch with the images of the material reality, and since images float and they can assume whatever form, therefore the whole thing is unreal. So postmodernism argues in this manner. I'll be because all this has been discussed already and I am only summing up. So feminism, post-colonialism, Orientalism, all these things have been dealt with properly in this series of discussions. And now I finally raise one or two questions for us to ponder over, so that you can go ahead from here and neatly, somewhat neatly, no, not exactly neatly, things can be put forward in this manner. As I'll take just 3 or 4 minutes to do so. I say that one of the common points of all literary theory from Renaissance onwards has been either incipient socialism or actual socialism, social equality and justice. This starts with the Renaissance period, when the lower sections of society will come forward and they will start interpreting the world from their angle. So there is a kind of a social endeavor involved in the Renaissance thought. It starts from there. But in the 19th century, when socialism becomes first an intellectual reality and then a social reality, and when in the 20th century there are whole countries and the number is getting larger day by day. So this kind of a system that people can live equally, people can live with dignity together, and that they may not be the slaves of circumstance or slaves of the market. Now this system has in fact rattled a large number of power centers in the 20th century. So you will realize that whatever goes in the name of socialism will be discussed in literary theory. So literary theory, after all, is social theory, and the question of justice is important in social theory, but this is equally important in literary theory, because literature draws upon the material that is produced in society, the intellectual and the emotional material that is produced in actual society. So you will find that in most of the theories that I have discussed, that I have talked about, are taking a position on socialism. For instance, you have this modernism, postmodernism. This says that the whole thing is unreal. So the whole thing is only just a name. It's a pattern. But then this is being said because somewhere in the world there are questions of justice and equality which are haunting the minds of people. And in order to take them in a different direction, you start saying all this is unreal. So it might be unreal for a person who can afford to, reign supreme. But for a poor person, the whole thing is not unreal. For instance, I think some philosopher said it, that there are people in the world for whom the bread is not an unreal thing. It's a real thing. It's not just a sound pattern. It's something real which can be eaten. And you can't go saying that eating also is a word, but because finally it comes down to the basic necessities and equality in society. So you will find that most of these theories of the 20th century are emerging at a time when the power of the people, the power of the masses is increasing. And therefore I would say that more and more thought is being now expended to explain the nature of reality today. I find it as a very welcome development. I say that if things are being discussed in a complex manner, if subtle things are being introduced, then people's consciousness is becoming enriched. Now people can think more, they can perceive more, and they can also then invent certain paradigms which will go parallel to the old paradigms. So I'm sure that if this thinking goes to the masses, and the masses are, as human beings, they start subtly understanding the reality around them, then the theory would have reached its valid and its legitimate end, which is equipping human beings with power to make a world after their wishes, after their hearts. And that way, I think this literary theory and theory in general and the world of ideas, this is creating a whole wealth of intellectual material that can be used by future generations to play an important role in the making of the world in which they live. In fact, as literary theory itself has said, that things are produced in the market and everywhere. So people will produce that world with their own efforts, and there will be a time when all of us will be not merely workers but also thinkers. And with that kind of a subtle thought that the theory is giving us, that thought will help us, forge a new world which will meet the expectations of the largest number of people in the world. So this is how I could conclude and sum up that it's a welcome development, and if there is something that you'd like to add, then I'd be
thank you so much, sir, for in fact talking about it and leaving with a very interesting idea that theory has given us these ideas through which future generations can in fact come up with in fact even better relevant ideas, and a world which is more livable and caters to social equality and justice. And so you had talked about new criticism, that it says that literature itself is real and there is no world outside the world of words. So sir, just briefly, if you could tell me what kind of resistance was this theory new criticism faced?
You see, there is a background to new criticism. New criticism started evolving itself around the time the First World War ended, and a whole country, a very, very large country called Soviet Russia, that came into being. And the credo, the faith and the intellectual system that Russia at that time swore by was reason, was some kind of a relevance of literature to life, and that writers should be expressing the aspirations of the larger masses. This was the emphasis of socialism. It is at this point, that many writers outside Russia, and many writers, whose interests were tied with the interests of the rulers in various countries, these people had to argue against this, that life and literature were integrated and all those things. So they had to say that life had nothing to do with literature, and that literature was a whole in its own way. So they would say, okay, don't discuss literature with reference to the trends outside. They said, take literature as a text and start analyzing this text from within. So if there is a character, you explain that character from within the text, but do not say what trend or aspect of reality this character is representing in actual life. So they said, keep life out of it. So the crux of socialist thinking about literature was that literature is a part of reality and it should contribute to the enhancement of a certain just pattern in that reality. So somehow the other writer, the new critic, would like to attack this idea by saying that literature had nothing to do with life. Literature was a self-contained unit, and therefore it should be read as a text. So this is how new criticism came into being, and a large number of people started buying this idea, particularly outside Soviet Russia. But this did not strike roots, for instance, in a third world country like India in the 1940s and 50s. In 50s, some people started copying this idea, and in the universities this was taught and text became important, but that was only confined to the universities. I think outside the university, literature still held a great appeal. For instance, Tagore in Bengal became a big name, not because of his texts, but because of the way he affected, influenced people. So it was an academic kind of an exercise where literature will be discussed as a text, but the common reader would not accept it. The common reader would say, no, literature is a matter of celebration, is a matter of getting joy from, etc. So you read, you write, you share, you bring some kind of harmony, or you make people aware of the disharmonious element in life which should be corrected, all those things. And I think in third world countries particularly, literature gained in value in the 20th century, taking no recourse to the methods used by new criticism. So that's how I would explain this.
Thank you so much, sir. In fact, I can quite well understand the idea now. And with this, I'd like to thank sir for summing up literary theory for us, and in fact taking us through this whole series on literary theory. And I'd also like to tell you that from tomorrow onwards, we're beginning a new series called Writing in India, and tomorrow shall be an introductory lecture to it. So I hope you always stay tuned in. And with this, I'd like to thank sir for being here. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful day.